If you're a horror fan and you've gone down even the slightest hole of the morbid curiosity for disturbing films, you've almost certainly heard of Pascal Laugier's 2008 film, Martyrs. Shows up on pretty much every list of the most disturbing films ever made, and its notoriety has given it quite the reputation, even among those who will use those lists more as something to avoid than recommendations. After releasing his debut film St. Agnes in 2005, Laugier was inspired by Eli Roth's Hostel the same year. At the time, he was going through a bout of severe depression, developing a nihilistic worldview that certainly reflects in the film he would go on to make, especially considering the entire inspiration behind it was to make a movie about pain. Movies take a really long time to make. Considering the path towards Martyrs was first sparked in 2005 and the movie wouldn't release until 2008, that's 3 years of Laugier's life that were dedicated to existing in a world that would do absolutely nothing to pull someone out of severe mental health struggles. Although, sometimes just that catharsis of getting those feelings out on the page can help. Martyrs is a miserable, brutal movie that absolutely does feel like it was made by someone who had very little faith in the world at the time he made it, and whether or not you can connect with the nihilism at the core of this story, the film does offer a very honest look at someone who dumped all of the hopelessness and misery they were dealing with at the time into a creative outlet, and there's something inherently fascinating about seeing such a raw reflection of these extremely dark feelings that I think to a degree are things that most people can relate to. That being said, when Laugier said that he wanted to make a movie about pain, he wasn't kidding. If you're looking for much more than that, you won't really find anything to chew on until the film's ambiguous ending. You have to sit through hell in order to understand any of the value beyond the surface level torture of the experience. Sure, through the first half of the movie there's some more palatable horror and more of a constantly moving narrative, but the last 35 to 40 minutes is going to be where I can see a lot of people tapping out, because it really can just feel like half of the movie is one long torture scene. And it pretty much is for all intents and purposes. I'm conflicted on how I feel about Martyrs as a whole, because it's a movie that absolutely succeeded at what it was trying to do. The first half is something I can say I liked a lot, but this is not a movie that's designed to be enjoyed. It's designed to make you feel miserable. And honestly, if it weren't for the very end of the film and a couple of other elements, I don't think that this movie would have stuck around as much as it has because of that. I totally understand why this kind of movie is not for everyone, and I definitely have my limits with them as well, but I do also think that there is value in engaging with experiences that can challenge your comfort levels and sort of act as a cold splash of water to the face. That being said, this isn't something you should ever feel like you have to watch, even if you're a massive horror fan. And I do have some genuine issues with it that I'll talk about, but because of some of the things that come towards the end, I can't deny that Martyrs is a film that will leave you thinking about it for quite a while after watching it, and the conclusion leaves so much room for interpretation that it's going to continue to be discussed and analyzed for a very long time. So consider this video me throwing my hat into that discussion. Often with these really disturbing movies, making a video about them makes me like the movie more because it kind of helps me process it. And through writing this script, I have absolutely gone from being like, I don't know how I feel about this movie, to like, you know what? I think I like Martyrs. Update from Evan after completing this video. I'm just going back and recording this section now. I'd honestly consider it among the best horror films ever made. Even though I don't think that I'll watch it very often, just, because of everything that I've mentioned already. It didn't make the top 100 horror movies of all time list from Fangoria for nothing. So let's talk about one of the most notorious disturbing films of all time, Martyrs. So Martyrs has a pretty unique structure to it, which makes it so that every time you think you know where the story is heading, it flips in some other direction that keeps you on your toes the whole time. It's set up early on as a straight-up revenge film, with Lucy seeking vengeance on the people involved with kidnapping and torturing her for over a year when she was younger. What makes this immediately interesting is that you're sort of getting what feels like the climax to a revenge movie as the opening of the film, where we don't know these characters yet. We don't really know what's going on aside from the fact that she was tortured. We don't know how she found them, and hell, when the scene starts, there's not even any indication that these are the bad guys. We're watching a happy family eating breakfast. Now, there's a hint, of course, that there's maybe something a little more messed up with them than normal when the mother starts dangling a dead mouse in front of their faces while they eat, and no one throws her through a window for doing it. It's in their DNA, I suppose. It's a great setup because it starts off like, oh, these people seem nice, and then it's, oh, that's kind of fucked up, and then suddenly someone starts blasting away at them with a shotgun, and the person doing it is one of the main characters of the film. She's getting her cathartic revenge, but we're not able to take part in the catharsis of it because we've not been involved in her pursuit, and that's a really interesting way to open the movie up. Also, I would be remiss to not mention that this sequence, from an action standpoint, is awesome. It's very dark, don't get me wrong, and you're instantly questioning who you're supposed to be rooting for here because she takes out the whole family and not just the parents, despite the kids not seemingly being aware of what their parents were doing. But like action choreography wise, this is really great. When you have a revenge movie that opens with the revenge, it raises so many questions about what the rest of the film is going to be, and it feels like Laugier was never content to allow you to settle into the film in any sense. One of the things that's introduced early on is this really creepy demonic thing that shows up throughout and chases Lucy. She first sees it as a kid, and after she takes these people out, she's viciously attacked by it in the house. I loved the way they went about handling the on-screen presence of this thing, because the way they never let you get a proper clear look at it makes it feel a lot more nightmarish. It's dingy and upsetting and shrill, and when it shows up, it'll start wailing away on Lucy with a razor blade, which provides a lot of very gnarly and cringe-inducing moments. Now, the important thing is that Anna, Lucy's friend, cannot see this thing, and as time goes on, it becomes a lot more clear what's actually going on with it. When Lucy escaped the place she was being held at as a kid, there was a room she stumbled on with another person who was also being held captive, but she opted not to save her because she was just so terrified that she needed to get away and was afraid to give any time to saving this other girl. So that's led to severe survivor's guilt, and that's manifesting as this distorted, rotten ghost of the girl she didn't save. It's quite a tragic angle that gets introduced when you realize this, because part of the reason she's seeking vengeance is that she feels if she kills the people who did this to them, then the girl will go away and she can be left alone without this constant looming threat because she's dealt with the people who did this to them. So you get these scenes where she's pleading in confusion after thinking she did what she had to do. This is probably my favorite element of the first half of the movie, how Laugier uses this thing as a tangible reflection of survivor's guilt and the lasting trauma that follows going through something as horrible as what Lucy did. One of the things that isn't clear is a big focus of the movie until the end is showing people who went through things like this and had it completely destroy them. And it's also where a lot of the hopelessness that Laugier was dealing with at the time comes out the clearest. This thing isn't only a manifestation of survivor's guilt, it's also the thing that Lucy sees as hurting her when really she's doing it to herself the whole time. When they were kids at the orphanage, Anna found Lucy in the bathtub, and Lucy immediately attributes the injuries she has to some mystery woman. The reality of it is that the trauma of her childhood was something that she was never able to reconcile with, and so her tendencies towards this sort of behavior and her intense guilt manifested themselves in something outside of her that she would hallucinate, because it's a hell of a lot easier to find forgiveness from other people than it is with yourself a lot of the time. That guilt she has is so strong that her mind conjured up some being that could hopefully be appeased once it was avenged, because that prospect is more within reach to Lucy than the idea of finding a way to move past the things on her own and come to terms with the decision she made. It's a truly haunting representation of survivor's guilt, and it's one of the ways that the movie deals with the cruelty of traumatic experiences in an upsettingly honest way, because sometimes people don't make it through. That's one of the things that makes this such a difficult watch, because often, even in horror movies that deal with trauma, people are able to find some level of solace by the end, but that's not the case here. It's especially impactful because of how raw and sinister the presentation of it is, and it's one of the parts where you can really feel Laugier exploring the hopelessness he was experiencing at the time. This poor woman had her life torn to shreds when she was a young child, and it has relentlessly haunted her ever since. Someone who did nothing to bring on the horrifying experience she went through, and has had such a hard time facing it that she unknowingly created a demon in her own mind and convinced herself that there was a way to quiet it down, to ease the constant onslaught of violence coming from within herself towards herself. And she's unable to do it. After killing the family in the hopes that it would bring her peace, she's almost immediately attacked once again and left in really rough shape, but it's later revealed that the mother actually survived the attack. Because we don't know the nature of what the thing pursuing Lucy actually is at this point in the movie, it's assumed that it's a real entity haunting her and pushing her to get vengeance for it. So when we see that the mother survived, the assumption then is that the reason she is still attacked is because the mother wasn't actually successfully killed, and then, taking her out will be the thing that hopefully frees Lucy. The truth of the matter, though, is that this is a reflection of the tragic reality that is a bit of a taboo subject for films to explore in such a brutal way. Sometimes people truly don't make it through, and life can sometimes give you these glimmers of hope that don't work, and they simply can't find a way to live a normal life after things like this. It's an endless cycle. Anna's the one who discovers that the mother survived, and she's not dealing with the same broken trauma that Lucy is, so she tries her best to hide this and help the woman escape into the woods, but Lucy catches them before and finishes her off, completing the thing that she came here to do and thinking that she'll now be free. But she's not. Through all of this depravity and sickness, the one thing that she thought would help quell this demon did nothing. And she's faced with the truth that no matter what she does, this has become something inescapable for her. She's too broken, too damaged by everything that's happened, and after doing the one thing she thought would free her only to be attacked again, she's seeing now for the first time that she truly doesn't have any hope. And so she gives up. It's an incredibly bleak moment in a film that has already been overwhelmingly dark, and it's far from the worst stuff here. Lucy's story is such a tragic part of this film, and it's here as the first example of someone who is unable to make it through the darkness, something that will be shown one more time before being used as a contrast for the events towards the end of the film. The discovery of a secret underground chamber in the house at the very least confirms that the people who Lucy killed were guilty of what she believed them to be, or the parents were at the very least, and in there she finds a woman who you can tell has been put through living hell without a word ever needing to be said. I'm not sure how much of this part of the movie I can even show, but her body is mangled and malnourished, she's entirely unable to speak and has this horrible contraption embedded into her head that prevents her from being able to see anything, and it's clear that she's been broken even more than Lucy was. She's barely human at this point, and once again, we're getting that nihilistic sense at the core of the film when Anna once again tries to do the right thing and help the woman, only to find her doing not nice things to her arm in a really nasty scene that I definitely can't show. We learn later on that the woman had come to believe that maggots were crawling under her skin, so what we're seeing is the traumatic response showing itself and, her trying to deal with that. She's not in the movie for very long, existing mainly to have another person who has no hope of ever finding peace before she's ultimately killed off by a mysterious crew of people who arrive at the house. It's also where you get a clear sense of the sort of escalation of what's going on here, where it starts out looking like a brutal revenge movie before turning into a bleak psychological horror film about trauma, and then it reveals this other angle of horrifying abuse and torment, and it's really only going to get worse. When these people arrive at the house, this is where we learn why Lucy was kidnapped and tortured, who that woman in the hidden chamber was, and get an idea of what's in store for Anna. So this is apparently an organization that was designed to find people to push to the limits of human suffering and, sort of like less cool Cenobites. This was prompted by an obsession that developed after seeing images of certain people who went through the worst kinds of suffering and seeing a look in their eyes that convinced these people that they had come in contact with the afterlife while still being alive, and this is something that they want to recreate so that whatever is on the other side can be relayed to them. That's why the movie's called Martyrs, because the people who are put through these experiences and come out as they see it transcending human perception are sort of seen as these divine beings who sacrifice themselves for this, whether or not it was voluntary. The woman at the head of all this is known only as Mademoiselle, and she recalls Lucy escaping as a child, noting that they weren't as organized at the time and they've made massive strides towards their goals, which is really not good for Anna, who they now have to act as their next candidate for martyrdom. And here's where I think, even for those who've made it this far into the movie, the odds of someone turning it off prematurely go up substantially, because the next 30 plus minutes of Martyrs is almost entirely one very, very long torture sequence. Now, I'm of two minds with how I feel about this section, because it's one of those things where I think the intended experience was achieved very well. The point of all this is to make it almost feel like you're right down there with Anna as she goes through the horror of the reality of her situation setting in, the constant beatings and force feedings at the hands of the people in this organization, the isolation, the darkness. It does work very well from that angle. It's a sickening experience that feels like it's never going to end, and it got to a point where I genuinely started to feel sick to my stomach, and in all honesty, it's not even that graphic. It's all the psychological side of this that makes it so hard to get through. The horrific exploitation and constant torment that Anna goes through is something that begins to seep into the viewer, and it is very effective, but it's so unpleasant and so unyielding in a way that honestly starts to just feel tedious. I'm not sure if boring is the right word, because that to me implies a lack of connection with what's going on screen, and that's certainly not the case. But it is something where I start to wonder just why in the hell I'm even watching the movie at all. Like, at this point, I really didn't feel like I was getting anything out of what the film was offering, aside from just feeling awful. It wasn't something where I could latch onto things like appreciating the craft of it, because all due respect, there really isn't much to this section outside of laser focusing on suffering. I actually had to enter the headspace of like, hey Evan, remember there's like cameras and lights and a crew around, and this is an actor and nothing bad is actually happening. That's not something I've had to do since I was like 12 years old. I think the more disturbing movies I watch, the more I'm appreciating just how good Speak No Evil is, because, well, the conclusion of that film elicited a much more intense and visceral reaction than anything in Martyrs. There was a clear message that was being conveyed during that sequence, and it was this climactic explosion of horror that had been getting built up to the entire time. And while Martyrs does have something to say, it is building up to something. It's not being said throughout this sequence in the same way that the really rough stuff in Speak No Evil was. So it really does just feel like you're watching torture for the sake of torture. And you are. Again, the whole point of this movie was to explore pain, and that's all they were really interested in doing here. It got to a point where I just straight up disliked the movie because it felt pointlessly bleak and like a sort of masturbatory outlet for someone who wanted to have a woman held captive, so he made a movie out of it. I don't know much about the dude, I'm not saying that that's what this is, but it's absolutely the feeling I had after sitting through this for so long. And if someone gets this far into it and decides to turn off the movie, then it will entirely seem like there was no point to any of it other than being an endurance test for the sake of it. The story of Laugier being in such a dark place makes this make more sense because it is just portraying suffering. I would question the motives a little more if he hadn't been going through something at the time. However, there is one thing they did here that hooked me right back in and got me fully immersed and invested, where the tone suddenly shifts once again. Watching this torture for so long is nauseating, and a big part of it is how little they give you in terms of other things to grab onto, including any sort of music throughout the whole thing. That is, until this very melancholic, contemplative piece of music starts playing when Anna gets close to losing herself and is submitted to what's going on. It's here where we get a reminder of a truth that this organization seems to be ignorant to, and it's a massive reason why they've been unable to achieve the things they've been trying to do, aside from the inherent issues with their actions. They mentioned earlier on that they'd found young women to be the most susceptible to this sort of transcendence of pain, and so that's been their focus. When that was first said, it was just another thing where it felt like, oh, how convenient for the torture scenes that it's young women who are the most vulnerable to this. I wonder what the motivation here is. But honestly, looking back on it, I think it's mostly to illustrate how narrow-minded the people running this organization are, because the mentality of thinking, oh, we can just get people of this gender and age completely neglects one of the biggest factors in how people deal with struggles in their lives. That being their own subjective life experiences, which the organization seemingly has not been taking into account at all. Anna had the advantage of witnessing someone who'd been through trauma without going through the same degree of it herself, and she grew up side by side with her, which gave her a lot of outside perspective on these sorts of struggles that allowed her to explore it without the clouded mind of having been through it herself, which now gives her an advantage because she's able to hold on to the things that she took in while learning how to help someone who was stuck in a hole. She had so much more clarity to work with. The thing is though, this isn't a scene where she's digging into a fond memory and finding some sort of strength. This is without a doubt one of the saddest scenes I have ever sat through, both because of the actual content of it, but also because of how authentic the hopelessness of the writing is. Now, I'm actually not sure if this is a conversation that Anna is remembering that her and Lucy had, or if it's something that's entirely being conjured up in her head. It's really not the important thing though. What matters is the philosophy of what's being said. The ending is where the conversations about the profound nature of the film are focused, but this scene is something that I feel like deserves way more attention than it gets. It feels like the fullest expression of someone who's been through way more than they feel like they're capable of handling, feeling that the world is a cold, unforgiving, and bleak place, and getting to a point where they decide that if they're going to find anything even resembling peace, then they simply need to let go. Give in to the suffering, give in to misery, let it all come at you and just accept that this is what the world is. It's absolutely depressing, and the music that goes along with it is this solemn lamentation for Anna as she lets herself go. It's a beautiful piece of music, but it's deeply tragic, and I need to mention once again how much more impactful I find these moments given the context they were written under. It's definitely not a philosophy that I buy into, at least not fully, but it's one that's so clearly communicated and so genuine in its presentation that I can't help but be absolutely enamored by it. It's my favorite scene of the movie without a doubt, but also one that just leaves me feeling a deep sadness every time I think about it. I really can't even find the proper words to describe what I feel while watching this or thinking about it. Also, the music is, it's beautiful. It's an absolutely stunning track. It really caught me off guard. Anna's not going to escape. There's really nothing she could do to get out at this point, and even if she did, she's too far gone after however long she's been put through hell here. This music, this memory, it's more of a goodbye and a sort of psychological funeral, a lamentation for Anna than it is her having some grand realization that will help her escape. You kind of feel like you have to let go of yourself in order to get through that section of the movie. It is an incredibly immersive and engaging experience. Honestly, this was the most impactful scene of the entire movie for me, at least in terms of like the feeling while I was watching it. The questions that linger after the end are equally interesting, so let's get into that. The final stage of Anna's torture is having all but the skin of her face removed, which means it's fair to say that Anna easily went through some of the worst stuff that I've ever seen in a movie. You don't see it happening, at least. They bring her into a side room and attach her to a contraption that immediately makes me uncomfortable the second I see it. The way they did her face up here looks almost too realistic given the context of the film, but that doesn't take long to be a forgotten thing once she goes through this final stage. It's a pretty horrifying reveal, but what's honestly more horrifying is the lack of reaction from Anna. She winces when it starts, but when it cuts back to her afterwards, she certainly has that same distant look that the people in those photographs did. So much so that when the person who's been force-feeding her goes downstairs, she has a haunting reaction. It's important to focus on what she's reacting to here. It's not the fact that a woman has been flayed alive, but it's the look in her eye. One of the things that makes this movie so disturbing on top of everything else is the callous manner in which the organization treats the people they bring in. Obviously, given what it is they're doing, they're not going to be kind to them, but it's not angry torture. They don't seem to be taking pleasure in it. It's just their job. They're doing it with this clinical approach in the same way that someone would be stocking shelves, and that utter disregard for the human is something that really gets under my skin. Because of the look in Anna's eye, this woman is sure that she has transcended, and so Mademoiselle is called to the house to verify that Anna has become a martyr, and she knows right as she sees her that it's happened. After God knows how long of them needlessly torturing people, they finally have someone who's made it through the whole way and come out as they see it on the other side of human suffering. Mademoiselle leans over and Anna begins to speak, but we don't hear anything that's said. The members of the organization are all invited to the house, being met with the news that someone has reached martyrdom and that their experience was shared with Mademoiselle, who will soon be out to share the words that Anna whispered to her and reveal the secrets of the afterlife. I did really love this visual of, going into Anna's eye to illustrate the cosmic transcendence that she's apparently gone through. It's a fantastic shot that shows how far away Anna's reality truly has become. The ending of Martyrs is where it really saves itself from feeling like meaningless torture porn, and it's one of the most interesting open-ended conclusions that I can think of in horror, and it's left me thinking about the movie constantly. Mademoiselle is taking a while to come down and relay Anna's message, so Etienne goes to find her locked in the bathroom upstairs, where he asks her if Anna's message was clear.
Il y a donc quelque chose.
Bien sûr.
And this is where it gets really interesting. She asks him if he's able to imagine what comes after death, to which he says that, of course, he can't.
Doutez, Etienne.
And that, right there, that final note, is the biggest thing that has kept this movie relevant over the years, because it's such a fascinating way to close off this story that felt like it was leading up to some cosmic revelation. However, before I talk about what Anna could have told Mademoiselle, I think the fact that this is the main point of discussion surrounding the film is sort of ironic. It's pretty clear that one of the things that was weighing on Laugier as he wrote the film is the uncaring nature of people in power, and how the suffering of people who they view as below them is sometimes seen as a platform to get information from, rather than something that should be stopped. They see demographics, not individuals, which is evidenced by how they narrowly thought that it was just young women who they should be doing this to. They'll find a way to justify their exploits for some greater good, but really it's all just selfishness. And yet the fact that we're so focused on what Anna said means that we almost did the same damn thing that the organization did by gathering around in some excited fervor waiting to hear the secret, while leaving behind the facts of what were done to Anna in the process. Yes, it's horrifying, and the movie is on all the disturbing lists, but I just find it so interesting that the film is so clearly critical of these power structures and the exploitation that comes along with them, and our focus on what Anna said almost makes us complicit in the things that were done to her in a way, which is a perfect angle for this film to take. Of course, that's not to say that we're wrong for wondering. Human curiosity is something that would absolutely be drawn to the words from someone who's potentially reached the afterlife and is able to say what happened, but it's also pointing the finger at the audience for focusing on that instead of the fact that someone was forced to go through something like this in order to get there. So, keep doubting. I can think of very few movies that can leave such an impact from 2 words. So what did Mademoiselle mean by this? What did Anna tell her? Well, for starters, I don't think that Anna said heaven and hell are real or anything like that, because if that's what was said, Mademoiselle would, of course, know that she's going to hell for what she's done, and I have a feeling she wouldn't be keen on rushing there if that was the case. If you do want to go down that path though, then keep doubting would be because knowing what they've done and what the consequences of it will be will destroy their lives. So remain in ignorance so you can at least try and make the most out of whatever you've got left before your judgment day comes. To be clear, I don't have any definitive answer as to what was said, and you're not meant to, but let's go over some things I think have some interesting implications. Anna could have told Mademoiselle that there was in fact nothing. There is no afterlife. You do not go on. In that case, Mademoiselle would be faced with the reality that everything she's done to all of these innocent people was entirely for nothing. The look on the eyes of those people was simply that of those who've lost their humanity and have fallen away, turned into nothing more than a biological system functioning only in the most basic manner. She had a sense that what she was doing had some greater purpose, but this would mean it was all for nothing and that Mademoiselle is nothing, and all of this suffering was for nothing. Keep doubting here would mean that you need to hold on to the potential of there being something. The lack of answer is what you need to maintain. If you learn the truth, then you will all share in the realization that there was no meaning in any of this and there is nothing afterwards. Your lives were wasted inflicting meaningless suffering on people. Anna could have told Mademoiselle that there is something after, but whatever it was so incomprehensible that she was forced to face that she would never be able to articulate it to the others, meaning that she would have to carry the burden of something she could not share. Keep doubting here would be a piece of advice, because once you learn the truth of it, You're no longer going to be able to exist as a human being in your day-to-day life. It's simply this cosmic, unknowable truth. It's too much to continue functioning. Another idea that I like is that Anna may have entirely withheld the truth from Mademoiselle, saying that she is not worthy of it or that she simply wouldn't be able to understand it. Knowing what happened, but refusing to tell her. There are so many different ways you can interpret this. I find the things that Mademoiselle does before taking herself out to be quite interesting, like with how she spends her final moments removing her makeup and fake lashes and strips herself back closer to the true version of herself, if you want to call it that, and there's a lot of interpretation there as well. Could be part of her realizing that everything she's done has been for naught, so she's trying to strip away the person who did those things as the done-up version of herself is how she showed herself to the organization. She's peeling that off as a way to accept the fact that the things that person wanted did not exist and could not bear fruit. It's almost like she's giving herself over to the reality of the lack of meaning and what that person was in search of, and trying to disconnect from it so she can go out with some sense of like, that's not entirely me, I have other value. It's also possible that it's her trying to strip away the sins of what she did in life before ending hers, or it could be that she's doing this to show her true face to the world before leaving it, perhaps in an act of accepting her sins and all of the terrible things that she's done in the hopes that if she doesn't hide from it, she'll be treated more gracefully on the other side. You could theorize about what the ending of this movie means forever, but those are just some of my thoughts about what may have been revealed to Mademoiselle by Anna. So that's Martyrs, one of the most notorious disturbing films of all time. It's not nearly as graphic as I was expecting it to be, but that doesn't mean I wouldn't consider it one of the tougher movies I've sat through simply because of how psychologically challenging it is. It's a bleak, tragic, depressing, nasty, cruel, exploitative film that portrays trauma and human suffering in a very uncomfortable way, and it does this extremely well. It is straight up an unpleasant movie, and not one I can sit here and tell you I enjoyed watching, but I also can't sit here and say it's not an extremely effective movie that had one hell of an impact on me, and really well made. I want to mention that at the time of writing this video, I've only seen the movie once, which is not usually how I go about this sort of thing, but because it left me thinking so deeply about its meaning and everything sticks in your head so clearly, I didn't feel the need to give it a second watch in order to write this video. It is such a potent experience. I definitely will watch it again, but this isn't something I think I'll find myself returning to all that often since it is so goddamn grueling. Laugier achieved what it was he set out to do, and the movie is made a hell of a lot more potent when you learn how much of a dark place he was in while making it, because that makes it much more of an honest exploration of suffering. I really hope he's doing better now. That life can be very difficult, and art is a beautiful expression of human experience, and I truly hope that this was something that helped him process the feelings he was having at the time. And there is beauty in that, even though the movie is horrific. Martyrs has a lot to make you ponder if you're able to make it through, but it's also not one I would blame anyone for avoiding because it's so relentlessly miserable. But man, does it ever do it well. Thanks for watching through to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video enough that you want to see more, and if that's the case, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell because YouTube can sometimes suck at recommending channels. A huge thank you to my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members who are a massive help in allowing me to continue committing as much time as I can to making these videos. If you want to gain access to things like behind the scenes material or gain early access to my videos, consider supporting me on either platform. As always, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.